All right, welcome everyone. We're going to get started now. Thanks so much for joining us. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. I hope everyone has enjoyed the summit so far. My name is Maya Tobias, and I'm the manager of partnerships and affiliate marketing at Course Hero. And I'm very excited to welcome you to this session. It's called Advancing Digital Literacy and Racial Equity. And it will be led by Dr. Savon Williams, assistant professor at the education department at Carthage College, as well as the program director for the Urban Education Preparation Program and ACT program, and Dr. Deetra Price Dennis, who's the executive director of the Center for Digital Learning and Innovation and a professor of teaching and learning at The Ohio State University's College of Education and Human Ecology. We really hope this session will inspire folks to share ideas with one another. So please use the chat to right now just introduce yourself, tell everyone where you're from, add your questions and comments in the chat box. There's also a Q&A box at the bottom, so I encourage everyone to put their questions in there. The speakers will be taking questions throughout the session, so definitely put your questions in that box. And then you can also upvote people's questions. So take a look at that question box. And if you see a question you like, please upvote it so that we can make sure to get to the questions that people are the most interested in. There is a way, if you're interested in saving the chat for yourself, there's 3 little dots you can click below the chat box. So feel free to do that if you want to save the chat. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Williams and Dr. Price Dennis.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. Thank you, everyone. We both know how busy this summit is and our summers are, so we appreciate being in conversation and in community with you this afternoon. So welcome.
Yes. Thank you all for being here. And so I will start, Dr. Price Dennis. So I'll just ask a question, and we can have a conversation around this topic. So my first question for us to kind of discuss is, how can racial and digital literacy help us understand this moment in time?
I love that question. And I love the fact that we're kicking off with why this topic, why now? And I think we see so many things converging in digital spaces. We are teaching, working, living, learning, buying cars and homes and getting medical care. And all of these things are happening in online spaces. And what we know in all of those interactions is that people are bringing their own ideologies around race, racial supremacy, stereotypes, biases, all of those things are indexing how we experience each other in all of those different platforms. And so this is a really great moment to kind of think about, how do those two things intersect and how do we make sense of it individually and as communities? What about you? What is this particular moment? How do you make sense of that? Why racial and digital literacy?
Yeah, I do love this question as well, because I think that this is something as educators we have to navigate. We have to consider our prior schema and knowledge around how we take in information and how we learned how to take in information over the years, and now how our students are taking in information. And so I think the most important thing now with digital literacy is that students are now able to communicate frequent and often, and they don't necessarily know where their sources are coming from as they spread information around on all the different platforms. So for me, I think it's always considering and navigating the different information that students are taking in, and how do we deal with that? Because whether we like it or not, it will become part of the conversations in our classrooms.
Absolutely. And I think what's difficult as our students are bringing in all these multiple knowledge sources into the classroom, helping them understand how to vet it when many of us, who are adults are still struggling with that. And we saw that with, the Cambridge Analytica issue during the 2016 election. We see it now, and then with generative AI and some of the founded concerns around how disinformation can now spread more widely. This is a really important kind of conversation to have, particularly when it amplifies biases around race And students might be turning to some of these different platforms to get information about, CRT or about white supremacy or whiteness or anything. And the information will be incorrect and doing a little bit more damage than helping them understand how to engage with each other as human beings in this world. So that's a really, really good point.
Yeah, I agree.
I think one thing that might be helpful before we take a pause to see, how the participants are kind of thinking about that question is maybe to layer on a little bit more and think about how are we defining racial and digital literacy. When you hear those terms, what stands out to you? How would you describe those terms?
So I would describe literacy historically, what we know, I'm a reading teacher, licensed reading teacher, and so I often have these conversations around what literacy is and how we can apply that term across content areas. And so I always like to start with traditionally, historically, how do we define literacy? And we can define it as reading, writing, speaking, and communicating traditionally through printed materials, videos, graphs, maps, and so forth. And so when we add on a layer of digital literacy, um, from my understanding, it means for us to have the ability to use information and communicate, evaluate, create, and disseminate information on several different media platforms. So social media, I'm not very well versed in things like Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat, but those different kind of platforms, as well as YouTube and whatnot. So how would you define it?
Yeah, I love how you started coming from your perspective as a reading teacher. We both have been in the classroom before, but my classroom experience is with the tinier humans. And so it's been a lot of years doing work in literacy and early literacy. And so I'll just build on what you said. And the first thing I think about is literacy is a social practice, and that it's ideological, that it's fluid, it's contested. We see that with all the legislation coming out around reading, and what it means to be a reader and a proficient reader or an effective reader or whatever those categories are, which are also contested and socially constructed. And that's the other piece, that all of these things are socially constructed. And we can say the same thing about race, that race is socially constructed, that it's fluid, that it's contested, and that the skills that we kind of demonstrate through different types of competencies really are reflection of what we've been taught and learned about race, about literacy. And then, of course, when we add on the digital piece, how do these two things merge in socio-technical spaces within the 21st century? And so some of this is really new for a lot of us, like thinking about the intersection, because I can probably remember in the 90s where there were most conversations I was seeing in ed tech and instructional technology is technology is neutral. We don't need to talk about multicultural. We don't need to talk about race. We don't need to talk about this thing. Very siloed. And there were lots of conversations happening in different camps around education. But this conversation we're having today is saying, let's be in conversation with each other, right? Like, we don't want to be siloed anymore. We see an intersection of these things playing out, because as we navigate all of those different platforms that you talked about, even as we read reports that come in, we could read them all through a racial literacy lens. When we talk about, constantly, I keep hearing how children of color and Black children are at risk. Well, that's racialized language. They go to schools that are at risk. That's also racialized language. But if you don't have that skill and competency to understand how institutional systems inform our understanding of what it means to be academically proficient, and then how those get layered onto other social constructs, it's just easy to parrot that language without questioning it. So I think racial literacy pushes us to understand that it is a social construct, and that we have a responsibility to ask critical questions. We have a responsibility to try to disrupt dehumanizing paradigms. And then we also have a responsibility to be reflective and reflexive about how we engage in those types of conversations, whether it's in person or online.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like how you share that information around racial literacy. I feel like that's a term that is nuanced that people don't quite have a good grasp on. I'm wondering, in your opinion, how can we kind of bridge that term literacy and make it kind of tangible and understandable for people around racial literacy, how you can become racially literate right now?
Yeah, I mean, I can move all these papers I have on my desk, y'all. I'm gonna read just a little sentence from a book I co-authored with Professor Yolanda C. Ruiz, and then I'm gonna get to the specifics around that answer. But we write that racial literacy is a skill when practiced. Individuals are able to probe the existence of racism and examine the effects of race as it intersects with institutional systems. And I think for me, within that definition, there are lots of layered pieces to think about our own competencies. So what does a racial literacy skill look like? How do we begin to think about probing? How do we begin to think about looking at the effects or the impacts of race as it intersects with institutions like schooling, finance, medicine? We can keep going on and down the list. And my co-author on this book has this really incredible framework where she talks about racial literacy development. And that model that she created before we wrote this book together really helps us think about the ways that we can create skills and practices around interrupting what we see as racial discrimination or any types of instances where racial inequity or racial injustice is present. How do we engage in something that she terms the archaeology of the self, which is really understanding where do ideas and notions of racism, bias, stereotype, where do they kind of live in us? It's really difficult to start this work if we haven't done that own dig of what's happening in our own, spirit, what's happening in our own intellect. How do we engage other people socially? How do we respond when we might be in a space where we're the only person who looks like us or has different identity markers or cultural affiliations? All of those things are giving us feedback, but what do we do with it? And how do we develop skills and practices to move past it? I'm just going to read the other ones without going on and on, but what's our historical literacy? And oh gosh, okay, I promise I won't say anything after this, but that's why the SCOTUS decision yesterday was so difficult, because when you're reading it through a racial literacy lens, it's really disheartening, as the kindest way I can put it, because it lacks historical literacy, critical reflection, critical humility, and critical love. So those are all the components that we would encourage people to think about developing skills and practices and competencies around to help think about the ways you would disrupt and dismantle institutional systems that really that don't recognize that race is a social construct. It's not biological. It's not rooted in this system of an inherent flaw on people of color.
Wow, I love how you talk about a protocol, some practical steps to disrupt, to communicate, to engage. I always feel like this work can be daunting when you can't have productive discourse with people who aren't able to kind of go along the continuum of growth and becoming more racially literate. I'm wondering, how do you have any examples or how you've connected that digital literacy to apply it practically in your own work?
Yeah, so I think what I'll start with is research, and then I want to turn that question right on you because I want to hear the same thing back from you. And it really starts with just the problems, like noticing the problems. That noticing piece to me is so interesting, because the things that I would notice that I would label as a problem, other people might not notice as a problem. They might be framing it a different way. So the way that we even approach and think about what could be considered a problem, that we would want to partner with community members or educators to really think about what question could we ask to actually try to figure out a way to understand this problem so that we can address the problem. And for me, those problems are things that tend to keep children from being their most creative, innovative, beautiful human selves. And that problem could be completely rooted in inequities around access to technologies. It could be rooted in curriculum, it could be rooted in the intersection of both of those things. And by curriculum, I mean materials and also content and what the standards are. So trying to figure out how do we address that. And the last way that I was able to do this right before the pandemic was with a teacher in New York City, works on the Lower East Side. And we were looking at the New York City Department of Education curriculum for second graders, and they had to learn about monuments around the city. And we both were just so dismayed. And this was 2019. So this was before all the conversations about monuments were happening stateside and globally. And we were just dismayed looking around at the monuments. And we thought, what if we raised a question like, how does something get to be a monument? Why is this a monument? Like, that's a question that second graders can wrap their head around. And like, what does it mean to memorialize somebody? Like, why does this person get a monument? And then more importantly, who would you give a monument to, right? If you were going to memorialize somebody for something, like, would it be these people? And the kids were so wonderful in starting to realize when they looked around New York City, who was represented, who wasn't represented. And of course, they had lots of things to say about Christopher Columbus, and really decided to create their vision of what it meant to honor someone, which is what they thought monuments should do, to bring awareness to a situation or issue that happened in society that's really important, that's a historical record that we should all remember, this site or this person or this event. They thought about the Nuyorican Cafe, and they thought what it took for those people to come together to put a place so that people of color can have a place to be in community with each other. So they built a monument for that. And we used a makerspace to do this kind of work because they don't have access to laser cutters or 3D printers. So we were able to bring in a lot of technology with them that way. And then the other person that they decided to do was community housing organizers. And one person that stood out to them was June Jacobs, and she was also someone from their community. So those are just ways of looking at a problem and then trying to figure out with partners. And at this time, it was just one classroom teacher, what question could we ask about this? And like, how do we engage students in doing this work? And of course, they're going to pull up all the other things, right? They're going to pull up all the inequities and all the injustices, and they're going to want to do something about it to represent it in a different way that points to the future they want to live in. They want to live in a world where monuments reflect a humanizing way of being in the world, where justice and equity are at the center of that. And they were very community oriented about it. They were really, even with the June Jacobs piece, it wasn't only about her, it was her in community with everyone else around the housing advocacy work. And it wasn't just one person like all the other monuments were around New York City. And so we thought that was so telling, that they constantly see people in community getting things done in community. It's not just one single hero. So I'll stop there because I really want to hear an example as well from you.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like when I'm hearing you talk about those things in New York, and I'm in Wisconsin, I totally can connect with what you're sharing about student engagement and kind of bringing it back to the students and making it student-centered and about community. And when I think about racial literacy, it really is about community and understanding the differences in your community and the connections and the differences and similarities that can connect us because we're all human. And so I do appreciate you sharing that story. The way I can connect to racial and digital literacy similarly is that we here at Carthage, I was able to run I want to give credit to the race and racism group that I have here at work with at Carthage. But we did created a 14-week course that is co-taught with 2 different disciplines. So it's I'm in the education department, and the person who worked with me is in the art department. And so I set the stage around racial literacy, and then she supports with the digital literacy piece. And so we were able to give our students some background and information and set the context around the legacies of race and racism. And part of it was around the monuments, and specifically we looked at historically what has also been happening in media, billboards and videos and sitcoms and movies, and how you can see the racism and the through line since the beginning of print and posters and videos and movies and whatnot. And then the final project was for the students to create a social justice documentary. And so a lot of students chose some of the things that happened here in Kenosha with the riots and the Cal Rittenhouse and the different things that happened here in our town. And so they went out into the community and they interviewed people and they talked about it, and they were able to share their digital literacy with our community, and um, talk about the things that matter to them the most, the way that they were impacted in 2020 and 2021. We're starting to rebuild the downtown area in Kenosha now after everything was burned down. You know, there were a lot of things that affected the students during the pandemic, while at the same time the civil unrest was happening. And they were able to talk about how they're you know, they had to learn on the computer, which was really different, and they were communicating with their friends differently. And they put that in their social justice videos, talked about, you know, how even after we were able to come back to school, they couldn't go, some students couldn't go back to school because the riots were happening, and you know, all these things were going on. So you know, I like you said, community and giving it to the students, you know, we need to give them credit. They know how to talk about race a lot better than my generation did, because we had to be colorblind and, you know, not notice people's sexual orientation or talk about religion, and, you know, because we didn't want to offend anyone. And so yeah, so that was pretty fun. A great experience. I can't wait to do it again this fall.
That sounds so powerful. I want to be in that class. I want to go teach it with you. I think you said so many beautiful things there. One is just really the power of bringing the outside in, like making the world, your community, the curriculum, and like letting that just flourish through the interest of the students. And the other piece, I think, because you're right, they bring so much to the conversation around race and equity and justice, that they make those connections immediately. And I'm always blown away by how quickly they arrive at things, and it took me to graduate school to be able to say. And
Yeah.
and I'm like, oh my gosh, you are so awesome. But I love the piece that there's a natural audience, right? Like, this isn't a thing they're doing for you. The social justice documentary isn't just for you. And I think this is why these two intersections are so well put together, because the one thing we know about literacy is that it should have a community. It should have someone that you're going to share it with. You know, when we think about our historical literacy practices, thinking back to Goldie Muhammad's work, and literary societies, people were reading and writing and communicating for a purpose, right? It wasn't just to get a grade. It had some bigger purpose, usually tied to some issue of equity. And so when we built in like legitimate real world experiences for them, where the audience is not just us, we have the privilege of looking at these things that they produce, these artifacts, but the audience is the world. Like, who do you want to communicate this to? I feel like there's a different sense of urgency in the type of teaching you're doing. And I can only imagine how your students are carrying those lessons forward in whatever work that they do and whatever fields they go into. They will be thinking a lot about, how do I make this meaningful and impactful beyond me? And that's a really, big lesson to teach. So thank you for that example.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. Yeah, that they all came from different majors, and they weren't all necessarily um media or communication majors. Like, we had athletes, and they all felt like they had a voice. They all could connect to it. I think some of the things that I notice in the work that I do around race and racism and DEIB work is that just because you are part of a race does not make you a race expert. And so, you know, a lot of people think that they have the information or knowledge or the vocabulary to speak on some things that they have, you know, no idea what they're talking about. They're not grounded in a lot of research, or there's no framework for them. And so we gave the students the power to say, like, yeah, you know, you know that you need to learn more and grow more, so that the people around you that you care about can also then grow, and it can spread. So I don't know if you want to.
Absolutely. I was curious, are you going to think about a pause too for
Yeah, I
questions?
was gonna say, did you want to jump for questions?
Yeah, let's see if there are any questions. Or
There's
even
not any
comments that
questions
people
right
have.
now. I was just gonna, write a reminder to everyone, please don't be shy about putting in questions. We're happy to take questions, so you can put them in the chat or the Q&A box. So yeah, we'll you guys can keep going a little and I'll stop you in a little if there's more questions.
Oh, okay. We want to make sure y'all ask questions, so please do. We're just as excited about what you're bringing to it and what you're thinking, and definitely if there are problems of practice where you're like, I tried this thing, or I'm thinking about this, like let's crowdsource. I can only imagine all the brilliant people on this call right now, so feel free to put out anything out there. Okay, I'm going to pivot to our next question. And that is, what informs your commitment to this work? And do you have recommendations for people who want to grow their practice in this area?
Yeah. So I think that what informs my commitment to this work is honestly my own personal experiences. I work at a PWI, predominantly white institution in Wisconsin. I'm from the city of Chicago, and I have a lot of experiences with racism, and the intersectionality of being a Black female, and also being in a very small group minority of women with Black women with doctorate degrees, is I'm sure you are very well aware of as well. And so, I think that that positionality kind of helps me stay committed, and just the different things that happen around me in my community kind of is what helps me stay committed and informed in what it is that I need to do for the people in my community and the people who share the same identities that I share. So I can say that I'm fortunate that I have a team of people that support me at Carthage College. Our president is committed to anti-racism here, and we have a good network of people around the country that we connect with to help us keep our finger on the pulse of all the different things. My head is constantly spinning between Florida and Wisconsin makes the news very frequently around the same issues as Florida. And so, we stay connected to the political discourse that's happening around reading, writing, ban books, CRT, and all those kinds of things. And so, knowing that the students that come to us are predominantly white, and how are we going to arm them to make the changes that they want to see happen, helps me stay committed to. But I'm curious, how would you respond to that question?
I'm so grateful for what you just shared. Believe it or not, y'all, we talked about questions, but we haven't like talked through the answers. So I'm trying to take notes, but also pay attention. Because I am so grateful just hearing you process some of those things, life experiences that you talked about really bringing you to this work. And then you said something to me that was so powerful about staying connected politically. And I'll be honest, in a couple of states I lived in, that made a lot of sense to do. Like it was just clear as day. I needed to understand politically. But then I got a little lazy, y'all, when I lived in New York City, because I felt like, oh, it's good, something happened down. It didn't matter what part of the world. New Yorkers were going to be out marching. We were going to have our stuff together. It was such an invigorating time living there, even though it was very sad and heartbreaking why we were all out in the streets, knowing that there was this community of people who were out in the streets, and that provided so much more content and so much more engagement about staying involved in this work and taking lessons that I was learning from the people that I might have been in protests with. Like what brought you to this protest? How did you find out about it? What was your life experience that made you think this is the time to speak up? Like learning from folks like that, and then trying to take those lessons into my classroom and teaching were also super helpful. And I'm in Ohio now, and I am agreeing with you that Ohio is trying to compete with Florida. I used to live in Texas. I try not to say that a lot, but there's moments that I used to say, well, at least we're not Mississippi. And then I'm like, well, at least we're not Texas. Now I'm like, dang, I don't know what to say because we are following right behind it. But that part of staying engaged politically I've been here since August, so almost a year is really important. So life experience for me as well. What's a little bit different for me is I grew up in West Virginia, so I'm Afro-Latin is kind of the word, you know, Black and Appalachian. And that's different for a lot of Black folks when they encounter me, because I've clearly spent a lot of time around Black people, because that's who I was raised by, believe it or not. But I also spent a lot of time around white people and Appalachian people, and really people who are on the economic fringe of everything, people who have decades and decades of medical malpractice and financial abuse from chemical companies and coal mines. So that community is its own thing, right? Like it's not just all about Bigfoot and disappearing in the Appalachian Mountains. There's just like its own thing. So most of the time as a kid, you know, I spend more of my time in trees and creeks and riding dune buggies than I did, you know, with shoes on and concrete in the sidewalk. And so when I encounter people, especially in New York, their assumption of who I was as a Black woman really didn't match who I was as a Black woman, because I grew up in Appalachia. And so a lot of those experiences have helped me help people understand the ways that you almost, you know, you think about graffiti, someone's placing something on you that may or may not represent you. So I always feel like there's graffiti on me that I did not choose. And I have to figure out how to help people understand you're making assumptions about who I am and what I believe, literally based on the fact that I'm a Black woman. And so that understanding that for me has helped me stay engaged in this work with my students, because they're doing that around language, they're doing that around gender. You know, once we start talking about intersectional identities, that becomes a whole nother conversation, because it's easier to silo. It's a lot different to start thinking about what it would look like to move through the world as a queer Indigenous woman who's neurodivergent. But when I put all that together, it helps us all continue to push ourselves to realize we don't have all the answers. We're going to constantly fail at this work, but it's our commitment to continue to try to honor people's humanity that really keeps me in it. And so I try to figure out who are people who seem to do that, like who are my guideposts. And that's really one of my recommendations is just, who are your guideposts in this work? Like for me, I think about James Baldwin, I think about Bell Hooks. I can go on and on forever, so I'm gonna lose people I know, but Grace Lee Boggs, Thich Nhat Hanh, Maya Angelou, Cynthia Dillard. I can just keep going on, but I think it's important, one of the most important things, and watch that list change over time. Make the list and then be amazed at yourself and who you keep adding to it, and expect it to change and grow, and who you might mark off of it, because y'all, some of these people you read don't really live the things they write. And then you meet them and you're like, you're not on my list anymore. Because all the love and all the things they talk about is not the way they give in the world. And so I try to be very discerning when I want to have a guide on that list, because there's something I need to learn that other people have thought about. And then really like things that wouldn't make sense when you talk about race and digital literacy, but like people like George Lucas and the Duffer Brothers, like people who engage in lots of speculative sci-fi fantasy work. George R.R. Martin from Game of Thrones, like so, and Marvel, like those are the other places that I turn, because I think story and imagination and speculation is really a place that we can play out what we want our world to look like around race and equity and justice.
Yeah,
Sorry, I could keep going on.
I do have a great question from the audience if you want to pause and take one.
Yeah, this is a great pause.
Okay, great. What recommendations do you have for navigating classroom spaces in states that are attempting to suppress discussions and lessons around racial or diversity related issues?
Okay. Read that one more time, please.
What recommendations do you have for navigating classroom spaces in states that are attempting to suppress discussions around racial or diversity related issues, which is becoming increasingly common, unfortunately?
Yeah. So I'm in the education department. I teach teachers. And I also subscribe to Bettina Love's abolitionist teaching. And I think that there is an urgency, there is a need, there's a responsibility that we have to, I don't want to say ignore, but to be bold in the way that we are going forth and educating our young ones. Because though this is treacherous, these are treacherous times that we have to be very careful. I know there's a lot, depending on what state you're in, there are some consequences, some real life consequences that you can face if someone's recording you, or if the board is monitoring what you're doing. I always tell my new teachers or my teacher candidates to always defer to your administrators, because those are the ones that will have to support you. But I always think also back to, like, this is really not new. We have been, this is a historical problem. Race is old and it will not ever be eradicated. So, it will just change and morph, and, there may be some lulls, but it will be a constant thing that we will have to face. So I always go back to my ancestors and think about, like, what happened when reading was banned and Black people were, hung for being caught with a book. I just was reading some more, I go back to the oldies and the goodies, and I go back to Frederick Douglass, and I kind of read through it, how that's the food for my soul that kind of keeps me going on this abolitionist work, to keep saying that, if I have to sneak in. When I was a reading teacher, I would put all the banned books, and I started teaching reading about 15 years ago, and banned books were still a thing. And that's how I got my reluctant readers in my alternative high school to read. I would put books in a brown paper bag and write, "Don't touch this. Don't read this. This is banned." And they would rip the bag. Every semester, I always had a group of students who were like ripping the bag open to read what it was. And a lot of those books are still on the banned book list. And so I just feel like now, going back to digital literacy, we have a far and wide reach on what students have access to, whether we ban a book in a library or not. And so I am just, I ask for forgiveness later, and I just say, this is something that, I have biracial children, and so I navigate that intersectionality, and I just feel like they have to know as much as they can about race and racism, because they're going to learn it one way or another, and I just need for it to be in the most productive way in the classroom. So that's what I do. I ask for forgiveness later, and I still keep on going until either they put handcuffs on me or they tell me that I am fired and no longer able to do this work. So what about you, Dr. Price-Dennis?
I love that answer. I go back to one of my guideposts, James Baldwin. You got to go for broke. And I want people to make decisions that make sense for them, right? Like, you need to keep your job, you have a mortgage, you have caregiver responsibilities, but for me, the consequences of not doing this work, when I think about everything that our ancestors, my ancestors have gone through, for me to stand here and to have the experiences that I have, and whatever platforms emerge or that I've created, co-created, it's the consequences of staying silent are too grave. Like, I can't morally live with that. So for me, this is also a moral imperative. Like, my humanity and who I want to be in the world doesn't allow me to stay silent. And so that's for me the first thing. And when I'm working with other people, being transparent. Here are my beliefs. Here are my values. Here's how they're going to show up if you have me come to your school. And you get to make that decision. Being in conversation with your school board, being in conversation with families. COVID was like a blessing in disguise for me, because I had gotten away from spending a lot of time in the community talking with families. But because of COVID, I was talking to people all over the world. And I'm like, are you sure you want me to talk to, I'm trying to think of what group of families. It might have been Istanbul, Turkey. It was like parents in a private school. And then, because Columbia had global centers all around the world. And so I was in conversations with people from pastoral Nigeria. And I'm like, but the thing I learned from every single conversation, whether it's families in Sao Paulo or Istanbul or Brooklyn, we were all dealing with the same issue during the pandemic. And there was something that united us across the globe. And even though these were all on Zoom, there was just a lot that I learned about their need to kind of understand how are you taking the dreams I have for my child and using the curriculum to get my child to where I want them to go? And that was really important for families to know that I understood the dreams they had for their children, or they wanted teachers to understand the dreams they had for their children. So I think if you're engaging in this work, being able to talk with families about who they are, what they need, and what they want for their children, what their hopes and their dreams are, what their ancestors wanted, the things that they are carrying forward and pouring into their kids, and how when you get that kid, what's standing in front of you, that child, is like generations of people trying to get to this moment. So like, what are you doing to get to the next moment, right? Like, what does that next iteration look like? And I think for me, it's those conversations with families that help me know you've got to be in conversations with families, because then when you're trying to do this type of work, you've had a conversation, you know where they want to go, and you know what you need them to do. So I need y'all to get on the email and let the school board know and the principal know this is what you're asking of me. And so that way we're constantly transparent in a community. So those are things I would add to build on to that. Oh, and then summer programs. There are freedom schools all over the country. And if you're a teacher and you're like, I can't do this in my classroom, please contact one of your freedom schools. They are through this Children's Defense Fund. It's such a beautiful organization and summer programs. Some of them in New York are even run year round. You can do all of this work in freedom schools. The curriculum is built for this type of work. So if you aren't able to do it and you're 9 to 5 and you're looking for something else, or you might find another career doing this work in freedom schools or creating your own, right? Like there are ways to engage in this work where you don't have to feel like your hands are tied and your heart is broke.
Yeah, I want to add to that too. Thank you for sharing that. That's a good resource that I appreciate as well. One of the things that I'm also finding that I didn't know through what you said about communication is that the more I'm talking to people, the more I'm seeing that there is a desire for administrators and school board members to actually get ahead of a lot of things that are happening in the state right now, because they don't know how to face it. And the more people are having conversations, the more people are understanding what CRT really is and whatnot. And so I would also encourage you to really talk to your administrators and really see how can we do a book club? How do we read some of the work that's coming out right now, including advancing racial literacies in teacher education. Shameless plug to Dr. Price Dennis, who co-authored the book. But book studies, professional development can happen in your own school. I say start small and let it spread as often as possible.
Great. We just have 2 minutes left. There is a question, but I'm not sure we can get to it. So maybe do you each want to just share a closing remark, and then I'll close out?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to be in conversation. This was really a beautiful afternoon. So thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who was on the call.
Same. I say thank you so much. I know there were some questions in the chat around resources, so hopefully you all had an opportunity to get the resources that were posted. Thank you for joining, and hopefully you found this to be something that you can carry this conversation on amongst the people in your own network as well.
Yeah, people really appreciated the resources. So I'm so glad that you provided those, because I got a lot of thanks in the chat for that. So thank you both for joining us today. This was a really fantastic session. So thank you to Dr. Williams and Dr. Price Dennis for sharing everything. For anyone who can stay with us today, I would love to invite you to join one of our upcoming sessions. They're available on our event agenda page. So I'm going to drop a note in the chat right now so you can have a link to that. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care. Have a beautiful weekend, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.